are going to have our session today on respectful ethics in practice. It turns out that one of the hardest problems facing privacy engineers is that we are on the pointy end of so many ethical choices. We're looking at how systems work, we're looking at how systems fail, and we're looking at how they fail for people. And often we're in the position where we are the ones who are making choices, recommending choices, and it's really, really, really hard. And it's something that I've seen folks burn out about over and over again, because it's a real skill and it's not something that we're taught, but it's something that we learn. So we're having a discussion about it today. Please put in your questions, and we're also going to start off with our wonderful panelists. So first up, we have Michelle Finner-Denedy. She is a founder, well-trusted advisor, and industry expert, increasing awareness around data privacy policies and the tools that provide privacy protection. She has a consulting firm these days, and she's also the CEO and co-founder of a privacy engineering tools company. It's in stealth mode. She's not going to tell you about it. But she's had a lot of roles in the past, including VP and Chief Privacy Officer, leading a lot of initiatives focused around regulatory compliance and privacy engineering at companies like Cisco, McAfee, Intel Security, Oracle, Sun Microsystems, and she co-authored the Privacy Engineers Manifesto. We also have Andreas Skau, who works at Google. So Andy's a staff privacy engineer in the Privacy and Data Protection Office. He has focused on a lot of things, a very, very long list of things. But two of the things that he's done, which are fairly unusual, he's one of the very few people who has worked on privacy in anti-abuse systems. It's a small club, that one, and it's a very, very ethically difficult club, and also for machine learning systems. So a lot of his work right now centers on preventing memorization and disclosure of user data by machine learning models and minimizing exceptional data handling in production abuse systems. And our last panelist here is Raman Chowdhury. She is the meta director at Twitter. That is an acronym. That is not a director of directors, although she might also be that. And her passion lies at the intersection of artificial intelligence and humanity. She's a pioneer in the field of applied algorithmic ethics, working with C-suite clients to create cutting-edge technical solutions for ethical, explainable, and transparent AI since 2017. So meta in this case means ML ethics, transparency, and accountability at Twitter. She also does lots of other interesting things, which are listed on the website. And we're going to have these folks first talk a little bit about what they think about these field and trade-offs that folks make and how we can do that better. And then I'm going to be asking them some questions. I hope the rest of you will be giving me some questions to ask them as well. Otherwise, you're getting what I make up. Fair? So let's go in introduction order, because that's the order y'all were on the website, honestly. Take it away, Michelle.
You know, how many unmutes have we done during a pandemic? So hello, and thank you, Leah, for that lovely introduction. And I see lots of OGs and goats and whatever we're calling them now in the participants. So please do participate. I think my journey in privacy and privacy ethics actually started in 1974. So I'm not that old, but I was a pretty little kid at that point when there was a book called The Right to Privacy published. And my dad had just finished his night school, law school. My mom had just started her trip through law school. And there's this great little book, and I'll post it later, with the cartoon on front with a gentleman sitting in front of a computer. and it was called The Right to Privacy. And I thought that was a cartoon book, and I actually read it. And that was really my earliest introduction to what kind of power dynamics should there be between, at that point, a government and its citizens. And particularly in that time, remember 74, we're still in that Vietnam era of, do citizens get to object to warfare making? So all of that way, way, way back machine, I think, applied going forward is, I think about context, meta context, and we have the meta director, so I'm excited about that, and citizen power. And I think that a lot of this AI, ML, privacy engineering and privacy ethics really goes to all those points. We have a lot more power than we think we do, and we have a lot more inputs to decision-making that we really have to consider and haven't necessarily routinized yet. So I think that's the core of privacy engineering for me, is applying the law and the policy to things engineers know how to do. Planning things, building things, looking at the materials available in the problem statement, and then thinking, how do we do ethical hacking? And I don't mean like security hacking, I mean hack our ethics. What are your assumptions when, I won't say their name, but a large music sharing service has a default on so that anyone can follow you and you can follow them. And you share these playlists, or you publish these playlists to them, and you can't opt out. What happens when you're a 14-year-old girl who happens to be breathing? Guess what? If a boy that likes you doesn't get his affections returned, he sends horrible music over and over again. And guess what happens to the AI? It gets trained to think that girl likes to hear about rape fantasy. So I'll just throw that little turd on the table for today, because that was my wake-up call this morning. So there's real life impacts to our esoteric decisions. So without further ado, I'll throw that cannon in there and hand it over to Andy.
Yeah, so my grandfather, right, was in World War II, and he worked on nuclear weapons safety devices, right? Making sure that the bombs don't go off until somebody pushes the trigger. And I guess the thing I didn't realize when I got into privacy engineering is that, fundamentally, nobody needs a privacy engineer unless they have a giant pile of data, which is, in many cases, I don't think anybody got into this field thinking, giant piles of data are okay for everybody to have and to use for any purpose that they like, right? So, but the thing is that, you do have to temper your idealism by the fact that nobody needs your work unless they are working on something that is at least slightly dangerous, right? So that presents a risk, in terms of ethical frog boiling, right? You get a sense of you start working with enormous piles of data, right? And it's not that you don't think that they're not dangerous anymore, right? It's just that becomes your day-to-day job. And, it's very easy to get sort of disconnected from the normal day-to-day ethics that other people have with respect to data, just because the issues that you are dealing with on, a pretty regular basis are things where you do have to make decisions essentially on a consequentialist basis, right? I work at Google. Google has over 2 billion users. The thing that happens 1 per 1 million users per year happens 6 times every day, right? So the things that you think about is never actually happening. The privacy outcomes that I think to the average person are sort of unimaginable are not things that don't happen. They're things that always happen, right? And so there's a question of not only, how do you avoid getting frog boiled, right? But how do you recognize when you're actually done with an ethical issue, right? Where you can't actually evaluate the issue any deeper than you've already done. It's also, it's easy to make these decisions too easily, but it's also easy to get mired in sort of decision paralysis because you are working on things which you may be able to avert down to the level where nobody would say that you're responsible for it anymore. But you're, nonetheless, the person with the obligation to prevent bad things from happening insofar as preventing bad things happening as possible. And that's sort of depressing, but that's sort of also where I am.
So I come from maybe a slightly different perspective in a different world. So I always like when I talk to privacy and security people, I almost say like hello from the past. Because the field of ML ethics, we're like your baby cousin who was just born yesterday. And like, since we have a poop theme, we're like walking around pooping our diapers. And I say it jokingly, but I say that very seriously. We have no standards. We have no best practices. We barely have tools. Our tools are usually not scalable. So that's the world that I live in. It is the world of your past. So it's interesting and it's great to hear such elevated conversation about things like decision making and decision paralysis, because most of our day-to-day is like talking to a model engineer and saying, no, it matters that you like scraped this data of people's faces off of like Tinder, because you can't do that. And they're like, why can't I do that? It's on the internet. And to be fair, I was a data science teacher for a bit, and we do teach them that. We do teach them the internet is your playground. Anything that's on the internet is fair to scrape, it's fair to take, and it's fair to analyze. So we are in the field of data science, but because of ML ethics, bringing in a culture shift that people are very unfamiliar with and uncomfortable with. So my hope for this panel and what I hope to take away from this whole event is, frankly, like best practices, learnings, horror stories, war stories that folks like myself can learn and apply to our field, because you all did a lot of really good work over the past years, and we're just starting on that journey.
We're happy to terrify you. With love.
Okay, so if everybody's done, then we're going to move into the Q&A session. Please send in your questions. I see a couple of really good ones coming in already. One of the things I'd love to hear us all discuss is, how do we deal with uncertainty? Because we live in a world where we don't know the impact of our choices for a number of reasons. One of them is things are effectively unknowable in the diversity of humanity and in some system behavior, right? Like we have the concept of a black swan, where it's a very large issue that we didn't know was in there, and surprise. But also, we can make a lot of predictions about how humans will interact with other humans and humans will interact with technology in the future. But those are predictions, and we've all been a little surprised by humanity at least once or twice. So how do you go about making choices in the face of that and like recognizing that we live in that world?
So I'll dive in. I have a big mouth, but you guys have to start next time. I think if you think that you want to operate in a world of certainty, I think you're in the wrong place. My daughter's math teacher has been teaching geometry for 25 years. She uses the same slides. That's a great role, and we need you in that field. Uncertainty is what we do, because what we're doing is figuring out not how does the current capability of systems serve the beast or the monetary financial services or governmental conspiracy theory, whatever your flavor is. We want the data to serve us, and we want to feel like we are autonomous, individual, carbon-based spaceships. So the uncertainty is built into the model. So just as how even your favorite meal is going to taste is going to be slightly different, things that are going to be different. So as Andy was saying, expect the different every day and expect the unexpected to come up every day when you're dealing with very, very large sets. So I think the way to deal with uncertainty is to know the knowable and sort of harness the things like process, the things like, here's the common. The common doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's valuable, but when you're looking at a large statistical model, know that the bell curve is the bell curve, and understand that if you're looking for value, the black swan might be the thing. If you're looking for the vuln, you might be looking over in the sigma. So I always tell my girls, be a Sigma rider. Don't be in the bell curve. That's what everybody else does. But if you're in the business of making sure that you're delivering the favorite breakfast cereal so that your machine storage and packaging systems in your supply chain are working, then go to the bell curve. So think about uncertainty as harnessing a range of knowable and knowable unknowables. And that's how you sort of set your table and say, what are the questions I'm asking? How am I going to interrogate good? And then how do I measure whether I'm going toward my ultimate goal is kind of the highest of high level digging into this topic.
I can pick up from Michelle. A lot of the work that folks like myself try to do is communicate uncertainty. So the negative halo impact of all things being AI and ML, and AI and ML things being lauded as, you know, the end all and be all, is that it's hard to communicate that these systems are probabilistic and not deterministic. And interestingly, if you just talk someone through the logic of it, like a business lead, whoever, they get it, but they've literally just never thought about it that way. I'm like, how can a machine actually say someone is going to commit a crime tomorrow in this place? Do you think human beings don't have free will? Like, what's the point? Like, what's the point of anything then? What's the point of life? Let's have an existential crisis. Once you explain things out, they understand, like, oh yeah, you know what, you're right. I mean, I could talk all day about, you know, the problem with the language of certainty that is used in my field and how it has made it incrementally difficult to talk about uncertainty. I'll also add that another complex is we live in a world of unintended consequences. So rather than, you know, battling baddies and, you know, malicious actors, we're often actually working against people's unconscious biases and actions that led to unintended outcomes. And, you know, very specifically, we are talking about things like, you know, all the isms, racism, sexism, classism, and, you know, people have very emotional reactions to them. You know, for example, I think there's a question here about hiring models. In an audit that I've done in the past of a hiring algorithm and a hiring model, the PM was really mad with me and said, I'm a woman, I would never make a model that discriminated against women. And I had to explain, this is not about you as a person. Like you did not do this, but it is an unintended outcome. So communicating uncertainty is so much of what we do. And it starts from basic principles of like literal education of what uncertainty is. I will add that one of my least favorite things that has happened in the mass adoption of AI is this obsession with the term accuracy. And again, it imparts a sense of certainty that does not exist. Accuracy is a statistical measurement that means something very particular. But when it travels down to a layperson, it sounds like, oh, this is how accurate it is. And to be fair, if you're not a data scientist, if you're not a statistician, the term accuracy means this is how correct it is in the real world. So we're battling, you know, and we're working with a lot of moving parts. And so uncertainty is like a really big part of what I think about all day long.
So, yeah, I mean, you know, like, I think you have to live with the possibility that you're going to screw up. You know, like, and not just that you're going to screw up, but that unanticipated things are going to happen to you. And, you know, some of them are going to be bad. I try to deal with this, at least in part, by knowing where I carry my risk, right? You know, like when I made a decision, I mean, here's the thing. Everybody in this room has made decisions that they're not particularly confident about, right? Like it had to go one way or the other, and you picked one way, right? You know, like knowing when you have made a decision that, you know, like may result in an incident, right? Because you had no other choice. And I don't mean organizationally you had no other choice. I mean technically you had no other choice, right? Means that you may need to pregame your incidents, right? You know, like let's say that I made the wrong decision here. What do we do to mitigate the effects of the decision that I made, right, over the long term? And this can result from a lot of different things, right? So for instance, you know, like if you're using differentially private stochastic gradient descent, it has an effect on like to make your model more private. It has an effect on outliers. And another way to say outliers is people who are underrepresented in your data set, right? So, you know, like very often you're making decisions between, you know, privacy and fairness. Or another good example is that, you know, like the inverse of dead naming is outing, right? So like, you know, if you do not make a decision, like if you make a decision to, you know, like reflect somebody's name change early, well, you may have outed them. If you make the decision to like reflect somebody's name change late, congratulations, you're probably dead naming them, right? So it's not just a matter of making decisions that are, you know, like balancing privacy against some other interest. It's very frequently the case that you're making decisions that balance privacy against privacy, right? You know, like, and this is especially a case in the abuse domain, right? So, you know, like making sure that, you know, you try to narrow down the window of risk when you are making a decision that you're not fully confident about. And then knowing that, you know, like if at some point things start to go very bad because you misestimated your risk, what are you going to do about the incident that occurs because you were wrong, right? That's also not a very, that's also a fairly depressing thing to say, but, you know, like, it's possible to be an adult about this and realize that, you know, like the decisions that you're making, you know, have an effect on a lot of different people, and sometimes they have unanticipated consequences. That just means that you have to fix them.
So as long as we're going to go down the things can go wrong and that's hard. How do you prevent ethical compassion sorts of burnout in privacy engineers, right? We all know that this is emotionally expensive work to do well. I mean, you can do it without it being emotionally expensive. I do not believe that it's possible to do it well without being emotionally expensive, because it means we are not really recognizing the impact of the choices that we make. So how do you deal with burnout there?
Ah, crap. I should probably take this one first. So I used to be a social worker, right? So like before I got into this field, I did 5 years, you know, like 2 as 2 at a homeless shelter, 2 at a domestic violence program. Frankly, this is kind of easier from like a compassion fatigue, you know, perspective, because all of the people whose I'm making decisions about are, you know, like I might read it in the New York Times, but they're not talking to me to my face, right? You know, like, so honestly, like I kind of have to like, you know, like my personal internal way of dealing with this is I try really hard to imagine the actual people whom I'm doing this to, right? Because it's harder for me. I think it's harder for me to stay connected than it is for me to, you know, like connected to the consequences of the decisions I'm making, than to just, you know, like get compassion fatigue, right? I don't know. Like I think a lot of it is, you know, like being extremely rigorous about your work. You know, like one thing that I did that really helped, right, when I started at Google is I wrote a list of things that I will not do for money, right? And I have not done anything on that list, right? You know, like it at the very least gave me some standards, like here are the lines that I won't cross, right? You know, like, and one of the things on that list is I will not continue to do this job if I stop caring. Anyway, that's just me.
I have some thoughts from maybe a slightly different perspective, because our field is so young and new, and especially I would say, and you know, maybe I'm kind of speaking from my own history with it. A few years ago, it felt like there were so few of us doing it. One very real burnout that we have really isn't compassion fatigue. It's literally like the always on thing, where you worry about taking time off, going on vacation, not being on social media, not raising awareness about an issue, because if you don't do it, someone, like, it won't happen and someone gets hurt. It quite literally feels like that. I think there's also a second component of it where we worry very much, and I think this is a collective we, that the products we build won't be good enough. And this kind of links back to the first question. So if someone does get harmed and you are responsible for building the system that was supposed to secure them, like, who are you then, right? Like, you know, like, you screwed up and you're supposed to be the one who knew better. And again, it's in part, and maybe it hits harder in this field because things are still so, arbitrary. What does it mean to do an algorithmic audit? Depends on who you ask, right? Literally, and like I have seen everything from a checklist of questions to in-depth algorithmic analyses, and all of those things have been called algorithmic audit. So part of that is a very heavy cross to bear. This one book that I read that I do actually suggest to many people who burn out in our field, because I think it's actually been around long enough that folks who are reaching their limit. It's called Against Purity by Alexa Shotwell, and it's about the climate change movement very specifically, but it's also it applies to, I think, all of us who do work that is socially meaningful and kind of all consuming sometimes. I'll also add that a good friend of mine, she is an anti-female genital mutilation activist. Like, she's very well known in the UK. She's an Order of the British Empire last year, big deal. And she once told me, she's like, I know it seems very different, the work you do and the work I do, because you sit behind a desk and get to wear fancy outfits and, go speak in fancy panels. And she's literally like working with, girls in Somalia. She's like, but it's emotionally, a very similar thing. And Andreas, I'm really glad you brought up, your history as a social worker. And because, I felt bad that she was making the same link. I'm like, you literally rescue girls. Like, I don't do anything even remotely like that. And she's like, no, but it carries the same emotional burden. She's like, the things you tell me are the same things that she coaches all of her counselors about, that it's okay to take time off. And it's okay if, you're not solving every problem in everything day to day. And I don't say this from like an egotistical perspective where you feel like you need to be the center of it. It's just you've literally seen the ball get dropped. One of my hopes, especially for my field, is that there are more and more people who are aware. So I feel like the work that the early folks have done has paid off. And it's almost like, you can relax a bit because there are ML engineers out there, plenty of them, who aren't necessarily working in ethical AI, but who do now have the right kinds of questions they can ask on their day-to-day jobs, and do know how to use some of the tools that have been put out there. So I'm optimistic, but definitely I would recommend that book for anybody who's feeling burnt out.
Yeah, I love that book, and it's very helpful. I actually when I was at McAfee in particular, and sort of how I was recruited in after the Intel acquisition, I was doing a lot of work in schools. It was amazing now looking back that there was once a time where every school district pushed back on having a cyberbullying policy. And, it's outrageous. That's like, being overlords, free speech. Now it's unthinkable. And you can see the real harms. And the pushback at that time was, well, when I was a kid, you met behind the schoolhouse and you pounded it out, and that's how you make your best friend. And I was like, okay, first of all, I was configured female and raised as such as a child. And so my kind of bullying was insidious and uglier. So we didn't go and pound each other after school. We said, you're ugly. No one loves you. You're not invited to the skating party. This kind of disconnect of like, what is your mental model of what bullying is? We weren't even talking about addressing the same problem. Now translate that into digital, and you feel like you're the principal of the school. You've got the answer. We feel like we've got some information. We've got the answer. And so I think this goes to this burnout, is you do feel like, because you've seen the ball be dropped, you've seen people giving up because it's hard and it is exhausting. But you see these little glimmers of progress when you invite in the kids. When do you feel bad? Well, I feel bad when someone, is friends on at that point, kids were still on Facebook. So it shows you how old I am. Now it's like there's more prayer groups than booty calls on Facebook, because it's a generational thing. But now the exclusionary bullying, and now apply that to people who were raised traditionally with a male ethic, right? And so what they're expected to do is go punch someone in the face. Not every young man wants to punch somebody in the face. And they're also hurt by words. So it's part of it is my long-winded way of saying, when you start to feel like you're the person with the answer, that's when you're starting to burn out. And that's what I like about, and there's a question actually, and I'll kind of like sideways into this about governance frameworks for ethical decision-making, because I think as you figure out the components of how are decisions made, not the final arbiter and not the first person who's setting the rules, but on and on, how are we collecting? Where are we collecting? What does our quality initiative have to do with this? How are we looking at the availability of someone at Twitter with your skill set? That should be in the annual report. How are we putting that into our ESG numbers? Because that's a business thing. It doesn't sound like a business thing, but it's a business thing. So when we make the business about the business of caring and serving our customers' employees, you start to share that burden with other people. You translate it into what they're doing. They don't have to become an ethicist, but they have to give you quality information so that you can do your job. And that being able to share that burden actually helps you be more creative, come up with problems, understand the changing culture that so rapidly iterates, and you're not physically with people all the time to be able to understand, you know, what do terms mean? What do pronouns mean? These are deeply personal things to individuals, and we need to somehow be able to figure out how do we deal in the collective. And so that's my second book recommendation. So you're going to start with Against Purity, because it's really good. And then if you haven't picked up Sarah Speakerman's work already, shame on you, get on it. She does ethics in robotics and IT and development. And she actually looks back at some of the ancient, so we're new in our fields, but we're not new in ethics. So going back to the Aristotle models of why are we here anyway? I mean, talk about existential threat, right? We're here to show purpose. We're here to love each other. We're here to feel compassion for each other. We're here to present ourselves as an individual worthy of blah, blah, blah. These become governance frameworks. And you can say, is this an issue about the air and water that makes you breathe? And I'm being, you know, talking in analogies. So your air and water, if you're an automotive company, might be the LiDAR that shows you that you're not going off a cliff or hitting a child. Then there's the next wave of what is the thing that is brand reputation that makes it feel good to buy from this entity or to participate on this platform. And that may be, like I was only slightly kidding about Facebook sort of aging itself out. The reputation of being cool, kid friendly, it's not lost to the world, but right now it's sort of overlooping on itself of like, I love Facebook because I'm old. So figuring out what that stack looks like, assigning tasks across the stack and getting metrics from more than just the tools and more than just the analysts or the data scientists, and then actually getting out of virtually out of your home and actually talking to some of your constituents and saying, what do you think about this? Just tell me what you think. I'm not an expert anymore. Just tell me what you think.
Okay, so we've got 7 minutes left and we have 17 million topics to get to. So I'm gonna let's run on that one. One of the things which I think most privacy engineers know is really important, but don't necessarily understand how to do really at all. And honestly, like, this is a deep topic. Short answer. What do you do about the fact that you are not everybody, right? You are you, and the world is a broad and beautiful and interesting place. And the things you're working with have to serve that population.
People get so, you know, like in terms of like representing the diversity of, you know, like not just problems that people have, but, you know, like diversity of people. Like you really do have to give people a direct say in, you know, like how their communities of interest are treated, right? And that means, you know, like hiring specifically to cover things that you don't understand, sometimes because you haven't lived them. I guess that's a simple answer.
You can build a software company and build tools that make identity as a service available to everyone. And I'm only being slightly tongue-in-cheek. I think sometimes we need to automate the stuff that we've learned and then get onto the more interesting and sticky wickets.
I can contribute, but I feel like I'm just in agreement. And Leah, I'm curious to know what other questions there are on your list of questions.
Okay, so one of the things that we've gotten in here in these questions is there are things which can make it fairly difficult to make ethical decisions beyond what are the technical choices that we have available. What are the things we know? What do we think is a good decision? Sometimes ethics is not the thing that the company we're working with or the team we're working with really cares about. What do we do in that situation? And I would love to get to one more question after that if we have time.
I'm not window dressing. If you'd like somebody to be window dressing to like paint a coat of paint over your bad ethical decision making, you can hire somebody else, because that's not what I do for a living.
Yeah, I mean, I would say same, or maybe to make the question a little bit more nuanced, sometimes there are parts of a company that are aligned with you and other parts that are not. I think when a practice is getting started and going, which is where most of people in my field are, you can't fight uphill battles on all ends. You know, pick and choose your partners wisely. You're still building your tools, you're still establishing yourself. So go do that with the people who are your friendlies, and then your momentum will carry along the people kicking and screaming, frankly.
Yeah, and I think I'll echo something Andy said earlier, which is, know when you're compromising yourself and your team, particularly if you are gifted enough to be a leader and have people that work with and for you, know your limits. And it's only come up actually once. I mean, I have left organizations that were, liability tornado and ethically questionable. So sometimes you got to walk. And there's only been one time in my career where I actually prepared 2 letters. One was a memo because I was acting as an attorney at the time. And the other one was my resignation letter. And everything that the sales team for this region wanted to do was legal in country. And I said to my CEO, here's my letter of resignation, and here's a letter of memo telling you that it is absolutely legal. And you have to choose, because this is the end of my road. And thankfully he chose the right way. So that was good. But it's rare, but sometimes you really do have to just, stick it to your sticking place and have enough courage and hopefully enough resources that you have those choices to make. Keep networking, so you have choices.
And I did want to like reinforce like something Roman said, which is, obviously, like among 100,000 employees, there's going to be a lot of variability, like in culture, as much as a small city, right? And so you're going to run into people who aren't going to want to listen to what you say, or are going to try to evade what you're doing. Like that's not an immediate quit signal. That's just a problem you need to handle. And if you're in a position of leadership, often, like those sort of social problems inside an organization are the predicate to getting any sort of technical problem solved.
Very much so. Okay, I think we're coming to the end. So if you have one last thing that piece of advice that you would want to give to folks in this field who to try and help them do better, both in this very complicated world that we live in.
Yeah, I'll talk because nobody else is talking. Know what you won't do for money, right? Because of the fact that you're going to be working for a company that has data problems, right? That's what privacy engineers actually do, right? So just know what it is that is the lines that you won't cross, right? And if you cannot write anything on that sheet of paper, please get out of the field.
I like that a lot, but I'll put a little bit of nuance up, because I think what I've learned over the years, and like Lori and Barb and some of the people who've known me for a dog's age will laugh at this, is I actually have mellowed over the years. I think when I first got started, I felt so passionate and like, don't you see, this is humanity, blah. Now it's like there's two ears and one mouth. And oftentimes my default setting is to assume that there's good intent. And so talk me through it, figure out how did the planning happen? What were the decisions being made? What were the compromises? What were your test subjects? And then let's figure out if there's a better way forward, because I've got some data too. So be sure that you're not being so much of a quote unquote advocate that you're being dismissed. Every time I get a recruiter call, they're like, oh, we don't want an advocate. We want someone to sit on our board and tell us when we can transfer data. And I'm like, so you want, like Andy said, like I'm supposed to wear the orange jumpsuit and be window dressing? There's a fine line. As we professionalize, you come in with a set of skills, you show your data, you show your work, but most importantly, you listen to people who think that they've done the right thing.
I'm going to echo what both folks said. I am a big advocate of the field I'm in as well, professionalizing. I think we're in a very interesting and pivotal stage where all media eyes are on us. It makes for a great headline if, you know, someone has a hot take, and like I for sure have my hot takes on Twitter all the time, sort of famous for them. But at the same time, when we do the work, when we show up to our jobs, we are not there to, you know, be the heroes and point the fingers and, you know, Scooby-Doo everything. We're there to actually build good ways for people to build good work. So it was a really great piece in Wired this week by Tom Simonite that talks about Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell and kind of who they were at Google and like what was their team, etc. And I tweeted about it. And what I loved about Meg's perspective was that, you know, we do this stuff because we love where we work and what we do. And sometimes I think, especially in my field, that gets a little bit lost. And I think maybe there's this romanticized view of those of us who do ML ethics that we're gonna get paid the big bucks by the big companies, but also get to wear the hat of being the outsider who points the fingers and points out all the problems all the time. Our job is to collaborate with people. We wouldn't do these jobs if we didn't like the people we work with or the company we work for. And the minute we don't anymore, like, you know, most of us have the luxury of walking away, and that's a very big privilege to have. So us professionalizing what we do and, you know, coming in and assuming that people meant to do the right thing and really just you're a guide is, I think, the healthiest way to approach this job.
Okay, so thank you all. Everyone go forth, help people build great things that respect the people who use the system and the people who are affected by the system. We're going to finish up this panel now and move on to our next thing, which is a networking break.